Hello, everyone. This is Mike Wilkerson. I'm the founder of Stormwell Advisors, the host of Stormwell.com, and the author of Why America Matters. I wanted to talk today about some lessons from lockdowns. So I think we're going to be debating for years about the efficacy of lockdowns, travel restrictions, vaccine passports, all these other things, other steps were put in place at the time to combat COVID-19. The evidence continues to mount, showing that these measures were largely ineffective in achieving their objectives and that they created devastating externalities and unintended consequences. Lockdowns and related measures are now a historical fact. With enough time having passed, that we can evaluate basic questions such as what did we learn and what changed in society as a result. The one thing is that for knowledge workers or people who worked in the office generally, these offices became irrelevant almost overnight, upending nearly a century of work tradition and custom. A new era of remote work that only a few futurists imagined was suddenly ushered in. Former office workers became fully aware of how their 1 to 2 hours or even more hours per day commute were robbing them of their most precious commodity, which was time. It turned out that many could be as or more productive without having to leave their families and their homes day after day. And at the same time, or as a result, skyscrapers, office parks, and centers of urban areas generally became redundant. Commercial real estate values were negatively impacted, and indeed, values were cut in half in some of the major cities like New York and San Francisco, where residents of those and other large cities began to ask hard questions and reconsider previously unchallenged assumptions, such as why am I living in a city and a state that demands of me an additional 10, 15% more in income taxes, while at the same time, the public services that those taxes are expected to fund are suddenly being cut or not being very effective in achieving their objectives. Then, why are these taxes being used to shelter and provide for masses of illegal immigrants who have never paid into the system? Or most fundamentally, why do I no longer feel safe in the streets or on public transportation? Why do I continue to be restricted in my apartment or holed up in my home long after the rest of the country has opened up? So what resulted from this was a major shift, a demographic shift, and an economic shift in vitality from places like New York and California to states like Florida, Texas, and others. These formerly great cities may continue to suffer a slow decline from the ongoing bleeding out of their tax revenue base and resulting deterioration of services and infrastructure if something very fundamental isn't changed. Now, old real estate fortunes will be lost and new ones will be made elsewhere. But what's clear is that the center of political, demographic, and economic gravity is migrating away from these states towards jurisdictions that still uphold the values of a free America. Now, we were reminded of the biblical truth that it is not good for man to be alone. So if you think about the mental health consequences of prolonged physical and emotional isolation and how this negatively impacted the lives of hundreds of thousands, millions of people, probably more than the virus itself. And unlike the virus, which mainly targeted the elderly and already sick, loneliness and despair affected young and old alike. Drug overdoses, especially fentanyl, became one of the leading causes of death during these years, killing a record of over 110,000 Americans in a 12-month period through much of 2021. So it turned out that alcohol and drugs and video games and Netflix and porn all equally provided to be cruel friends and false comforts to a species designed to live in fellowship and physical proximity with one another. We must never forget that free Americans were prohibited from attending churches and synagogues and many other forms of community life that, as it turns out, are absolutely necessary for human thriving. At the same time, lockdowns did little to achieve better health outcomes, but substantially hurt both economic and educational performance. States that opened early showed no negative impact on mortality and morbidity, other measures, health measures relative to those states that didn't. But importantly, the states that abandoned lockdowns early demonstrated statistically significant superior outcomes in both educational performance, such as GDP growth, rates of employment, new hires, et cetera, and educational development, like standardized test scores at the same age compared with those states that didn't. Now, at the same time, speaking of schools and education, parents learned, in many cases for the first time, what was actually being taught to their children in their schools. And for many parents, this was a shocking revelation to understand that school was no longer primarily about reading, writing, and arithmetic, let alone training up good future citizens, but about indoctrinating a specific political, social, and sexual worldview, which taken collectively was designed to undermine the former ideals of the nation, which had been rooted in traditional values such as religious faith, family, patriotism. Now, fortunately, this awakening has led to a substantially greater participation by parents in their children's education and the beginning, I'd say, of the upending of many of the hidden power structures that are dedicated to this progressive and Marxist so-called woke agenda. Now, by shutting down thousands of local and family-owned small businesses and suffocating others with unending and impossible to follow red tape, while major corporations continue to operate as before, government leaders demonstrated to many small business owners and entrepreneurs that the deck was stacked against them. The moneyed interests would always win, and the system was corrupt. Bankrupted and devastated to the point of despair, an entire generation of entrepreneurs may never have the opportunity or the will to start again. Free speech itself was revealed as a fantasy. We saw how the large corporate media outlets censored, canceled, and silenced dissent that ran against the propaganda narrative that was being put out by government and by the Biden administration. We learned how the FBI and other organs of the state were pulling the strings, telling these platforms such as Twitter, such as Meta, et cetera, what to say and what not to be allowed to be said on their platforms. Now, the consequence of that is that legacy media, which was already beginning to die, is dying faster. Those who seek the truth, those who tell the truth, and those who want to hear it have largely migrated elsewhere. And fortunately, we have independent platforms such as X and individual voices, mine included, that are trying to tell the truth about what's going on and providing Americans and people around the world with a better understanding of what's actually happening. Now, what the American people saw in their children's schools and what they heard their political leaders say and watched them do, and how they were repeatedly gaslighted and lied to about so many things by these same leaders in the media that parroted them, ranging from the origins of the virus to the efficacy of masks and lockdowns to the safety of vaccines, has resulted in a sea change in Americans' attitudes towards the so-called elite. The vast majority of Americans, and the data, the statistics, the surveys bear this out, the polls, that Americans no longer trust their political leaders, their experts, their professors, their teachers, their media, or their public institutions. Now, a state of trustlessness is unhealthy over the longer term, yet today it's absolutely necessary if we're going to bring about the kind of institutional and cultural reform and change required if America has any hope for its future as a strong and independent nation and as a home of free people, free citizens. This process needs to run its course and result in a complete overhaul of our institutions, a reformation of the values of our society, and a restoration of a culture of we the people. At a minimum, this lack of trust implies that future leaders should think very carefully before attempting to repeat the tyrannical actions that were undertaken during this time. Americans were willing to comply once and got badly burned by it. The next attempt at communist-style authoritarian control is likely to be met with much stiffer resistance from the tens of millions of ordinary Americans who just want to be left alone, free from government intervention, and with the liberty and human dignity they need to make a living, to provide for their families, and ensure that their children can grow up free, thoughtful, and prosperous, and not as mindless and dependents of a socialist state. So I hope you found this interesting and thought-provoking. If so, and you're watching this on YouTube, please don't forget to give it a like. It really helps a lot. Share it with others. Subscribe to my YouTube channel and turn on the notifications bell. Trying to come out with content on a regular basis that addresses a number of issues ranging from the economy and geopolitics and all sorts of other things, whatever interests me at the time and whatever I feel a passion to talk about and share. So thank you for being here with me, and we'll see you next time on the stormwell.com.